Alright gang, today we're going to do a little tutorial on how to make some icons in Illustrator. So if I just pick an object, and in this case I picked a stopwatch, I'll type it into Google and head over to the image search. And if you wanted to, you could also look for the object that you're planning on plus the word icon. It's likely that they'll pop up anyway, and we can see I have a whole bunch of options here. So as I look through icons that have already been produced, such as this one, I can start to get a sense of the different illustration styles we might encounter. So here's that really flat kind of cell shaded thing. This one's a little too simple for me. And I really like looking at other people's work because you know right away if you like what they're doing or don't like what they're doing. Here's something super graphical, just black and white. And you can see that there's other ones that have strange proportions. So sometimes we have these three dots up top. Sometimes there's just the central one. Sometimes there's two. So down here, for example, these knobs that are sticking out look way too big to me. With this one over here, I like that there's a little more detail in the dial, but maybe there's a sort of a conflict between the big fat lines and the little teeny tiny skinny lines. This one's starting to get there, this all line work and so forth. So I can start to get a sense of the options that are out there and how I might make my style a sort of blend of the different possibilities. So if I want to, I can download some of these pictures to my desktop. Sometimes I'll find something like this useful. So let's just pick, say, this image right here. Google recently changed the way you download images, so sometimes you can just drag them directly from here. I think sometimes you won't be able to get away with that, or you'll get like a sort of miniature version. So we'll take that one. And as with all the projects, I recommend you keep them organized. So if we call this Illustrator icon, and then spell it right, we'll put our source material in there, and then we can go ahead and open up Illustrator. I've already got it open down here. So it prompts me to look at old files, so I'll just say open. And then if I direct myself back to the desktop and Illustrator icon, I can just open this JPEG file directly, and it'll load right into Illustrator. Illustrator is often considered the place to go, specifically when working with vector graphics, right? So these graphics that are defined by math. But honestly, in Photoshop or Illustrator, you can do both vector and raster graphics. Raster being the graphics that are made up of grids of pixels, like this image that I downloaded, basically digital photographs. So I'll click over here on the little magnifying glass, and I can zoom in a little bit and sort of get a feel for my image. Next, I'll pick this black arrow, and by default on the right-hand side, you should have the layers window up. If you don't, you can head to View, or rather Window, and check or uncheck everything that you want to look at. So we're looking at layers. And then I'll have a little drop down here, and we'll see the image that I have opened into Illustrator. It doesn't open by itself, it sort of opens into an Illustrator layer. So the first thing I'll do is click right here next to the eye, and that's going to lock this layer so I can't accidentally drag it. And you can see the computer trying to tell me with a little cross next to my pencil that that's not editable. Then in the lower right hand corner of the layers window, I can click for a new layer, and this one is set on top of my background layer, so any drawings I make will fall on top of this image. And now I can start to sort of re-illustrate it and see what I want it to do. Now in this particular case, I don't want to do a really slavish reproduction that's completely photographic. I think I want to do something that's more graphic in nature, that sort of strips the image down to maybe a small subset of colors and a limited amount of information. So a lot of this information has to fall away. So I need to start thinking about, does this tiny dial need to be here? Do we need to have both the black and the red arms? What about the text? Do both the buttons need to be there? And so forth. So keep those in the back of your mind, and then let's look at a little more technical information. Okay, next up I'm going to go over to View, and then I'll come down here and say Show Grid. So when we're working with these projects that are sort of techy in nature, my resulting graphic is definitely going to look like it came off of a computer. Sometimes I find it really useful to work in accordance with a fairly fat grid. So I don't want to give myself too many options to make little tiny details. So what we're going to do is define exactly how big these grid vertices are, how much space there is in between them, and try to keep them as large as possible relative to the kind of information we're trying to communicate. Then when we make graphics, we'll have all the graphics snapped to the grid, and that will give them a sort of unity that comes through a consistent proportion. It'll make all your drawings look better. So again, I've verified that I can't move this by accident. Now on the Macintosh at least, I will come up to, I believe it's Illustrator CC Preferences, and there's a couple of things I want to look at. If I go down to Guides and Grid, if you want, you can change around these lines so that they're a little bit easier to see. I might make them slightly darker just to make sure you guys can see them on this video. So I'll pull that a little darker. Now right now it says grid line every inch, and subdivisions, that would be 8 minor grid lines for every big grid line. I don't really know how inches relate to this particular image because it's just an image. It's not a print or something that I could measure with a ruler. So I think I'm actually going to leave the grid about where it is, and we can come back and modify this if we need to. You can also see here grid and back is checked. So if I uncheck that and then hit OK, my grid lines get a little darker so you can see them. And now they're marching out in front of the image, which should make things a little bit easier to work on. Okay, temporarily I'm going to unlock this image, and I want to kind of move it around so that the center of this circle is right there on 2 of the dark grid vertices. This isn't strictly necessary, but it's going to make it just a little bit easier when I start making circles on centers and things like that in order for the alignments to take place. So we're just going to get that somewhat close. So I can see, grid vertices landing right around here, and I'll relock that guy. Okay, so next up I'm going to go down to the color picker. So here we have the fill colors of our graphics and the stroke colors. And I'm going to work just with fills. So let's double click this guy. And I'll go into more detail in terms of how these color spaces work in another video. But for right now, you can just kind of noodle around. So you move this selector up and down, and you can see we're really desaturated and light at the upper right, and really saturated and dark at the lower right, and sort of all the different colors in between. So I'm just going to pick something that's in the gray area. So therefore, it doesn't really even matter what hue I'm working with because I'm all desaturated over here. And I'll hit OK. And then we'll start to work with just some of the basic geometric shapes. So this time out, I recommend for making icons, don't really illustrate anything freeform. Let's try sticking to just basic geometric shapes and then complicating them through how they intersect and so forth to keep things simple and looking really tight. I'll pick the ellipse tool. A circle, of course, is a type of ellipse, and you see I need to select my layer 2, or else the locked layer will tell me I'm not allowed to do any drawing. Finally, in terms of setup, we'll go to View, and then I'll say Snap to Grid, and then I will start from the middle of my circle, and as I stretch that out, you can see it snapping to the grid as I go. I want to hold Shift, which will keep it circular, and I want to hold Option, which will keep it growing from the center. And then I can get something that looks more or less like that. So it's not absolutely stuck to the very center of this image, but eventually the image is just going to go away, and all that'll be left is the graphic.